Hello, welcome back to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg. I am here today doing a very different kind of BookTube prize quarterfinals wrap-up than I had intended. If you follow along at all, you know that in the first round of the BookTube prize for 2020, which was the octafinals, I did a reading vlog where I followed along with my progress, reading the books that I had been assigned and my opinions of them and my wrap-up of them. And I did that again for this round, very painstakingly over the 2 months in which the round was open. And I had it ready to go, and I lost the video. I don't want to talk about it. It's still very raw. So what I'm going to do instead is I am going to just run through the books in the order in which I read them, give my opinion of them, and try to remember as much of the details that I had talked about as I can. And we'll see how that goes. And because I now know the 3 books that are advancing into the semifinals, I will talk about that. And we'll just see how that goes. It's not what I intended to do, but it's fine. By the way, I don't know if you've noticed, my Pride stash is back. Obviously, in most places, Pride celebrations in the month of June have been canceled. They have been in Montana as well. So I decided I'm just gonna wear Pride on my face. Again, I did this last year for Pride and then ended up keeping it all summer long, and I wanted to do it again this year, especially since there won't be Pride. It makes me feel like I'm doing something to acknowledge Pride. Anyway, getting into the BookTube prize. The first one I read was The Only Plane in the Sky, An Oral History of 9/11 by Garrett M. Graff, and that was a very strategic decision on my part. The reason being I struggle very much with 9/11 representation. It can be very difficult for me to read about or to talk about, and I can be very angry at the way something is portrayed if 9/11 is involved. For example, my year of rest and relaxation involves 9/11 in a way that made me very angry. The Emperor's Children, representation of 9/11 and the reaction to it made me very angry in that book. So it's a tough subject for me. And I'm going to count this book for my Read Outside Your Comfort Zone challenge because there is absolutely no way I would have ever picked this book up on my own. And it was a very difficult read. I listened to this on audio through Scribd, and it was really difficult. And I wanted to give myself time to get through it. And that decision really paid off because there were days at a time when I could only listen to maybe 10, 15 minutes at a time. There were days when I would start listening, get maybe 2 minutes in and think, I can't do this right now. It is a very painful book, at least for me. I think it would be for most people. The good thing I got out of it was that it forced me to process a lot of my own feelings about 9/11 because ostensibly I didn't lose anyone I know on 9/11. I identify as a New Yorker, but I didn't live in New York City at the time 9/11 happened. So it always seems kind of inexplicable to me why it's such a tough subject for me. And listening to this audio really forced me to come to terms with that. And I think I came up with something of an answer, which was, one of the things I think this book does really well is it captures the confusion of the day, because it's all about the day and the way in which everything went down and the processing of it. And then it looks forward a little bit at the end, but it's very much about the way things went down in a sort of real-time perspective. And I think that's a really good thing to capture because it's very easy once something is in the past, it's very easy to remember the finished product. But on 9/11, there was a lot of confusion, there was a lot of misinformation, there was a lot of pain and agony and speculation, and nobody really knew what was happening. And for me, I was working at Borders at the time, so I went into work in the morning. I was putting out new books because it was a Tuesday, so new books were being released. I remember we had just gotten copies of The Corrections in by Jonathan Franzen, so I was putting them out. I think Jack Welch had a new release that day, so I was putting all the new releases out when I heard what happened. And we were not allowed to leave. Our district manager his office was in the Borders, which was at the base of the World Trade Center. There was a little shopping mall there. And he was fine. Everybody in that Borders was fine, but of course, nobody could get in touch with him because he was actively running from the rubble like a lot of the other people. So the day was half over by the time I got home, and this was the day before smartphones. It was before, there wasn't ready internet access in the store. We didn't have TVs in the store. I was only hearing about what was happening. And it's very difficult to visualize anything that happened on 9/11, except, I mean, you can now because we've all seen it. But on the day when somebody tells you a plane hit the building, you don't know what that looks like. When somebody tells you the building fell, you don't know what that looks like. When somebody tells you the next building fell, you don't know what that looks like. And I think not being able to see and the confusion that we couldn't leave, it did cause its own form of trauma. But the main thing for me was that my father boarded a plane on the morning of 9/11. He was in the airport, the same airport that I think 2 of the planes left from. He would have been going through security at the same time as the people who boarded the planes that were hijacked. He would have been going through security at the same time as the hijackers themselves. And for a good chunk of the day, I had no idea if my father had landed safely at his destination. He was going to Washington, D.C. And of course, now we know they were targeting planes that were going across the country because there was more fuel on those planes. We didn't know that on 9/11. So for a chunk of the day, I didn't know if my father was alive or not. And finally, we were able to get word. And I think that is actually the thing that has been causing all of this trauma and pain for me over all of these years, was that it's all still there. I cried my way through this book. It was really difficult to listen to, but I also feel like it healed me in a way. And I think that this is an important book for younger people, because my foster son, for example, was born in 2002. His mother was pregnant with him on 9/11. He didn't experience it. So I think it's a really good, important resource about the day and everything that happened and what it felt like to be going through it. The one thing I will say is listening to an audio was both a good choice because it helped me get through it. There were days when, in some of the more difficult parts, I needed to be working on a project and listening because I needed that distance from the book and the subject matter just in order to get by. But, and I didn't know this, and I think this is a good warning to people out there, they use some real audio clips in the audiobook. For an example, they use clips of flight attendants from the hijacked planes speaking to people at ground control, and I didn't know that going in. And for me, that's very difficult to listen to because you know that one half of that conversation was shortly going to die, and that's very hard to listen to. Thankfully, there's not a whole lot of that, but I wish I had known going in. That was one of the things that made it very difficult. So I don't think any book has made me cry as much or as consistently as this one. And that made it a very difficult thing to judge because on the one hand, I actively didn't want to engage. It was a very painful experience to read this book for me, but on the other hand, it's a really important experience. So I wrestled with that. In fact, most of my vlog was taken up with the reading of The Only Plane in the Sky. And I think most of this video is going to be taking up talking about it because of all the stuff that I went through with it, and I didn't know where it was going to end up. So it was the first book that I read. And I think it's a really good book. It's a very painful book. It's an important book, especially if you were not alive on 9/11, to find out what happened. One thing it does not do a whole lot of, because it's not its purpose, is it doesn't look ahead very much. Like, it talks about George W. Bush a lot because he was president. But it doesn't really talk about the ways in which 9/11 was used to misinform the public and lead them into war with the country that was not responsible or any of that stuff. It does a little bit, but it doesn't. And of course, I wanted it to do that, and it didn't. But anyway, so that was the experience with The Only Plane in the Sky. After The Only Plane in the Sky was finished, I started doing 2 books at once. I started Trick Mirror by Tolentino and Sea People, The Puzzle of Polynesia by Christina Thompson on audio. And I finished Sea People first. The audio of this book is great. The narrator has, I forget her name, but she has this really great voice. I absolutely recommend it, although you will be missing out on the photos, apparently, that are in the book, which I feel like I need to pick up a copy of this book at some point just to look at the photos. This is a really great book, very charming. It's full of really great information. It's told really well. It's told almost like a story. It's like history, but that's kind of dabbling in narrative nonfiction, but not quite going all the way into that. It is the type of nonfiction I like because it's a subject matter I did not know a lot about at all. and yet it's so interesting. So basically, it's about how Polynesia was populated, or speculation about it, because we don't really know. Basically, there's so many islands in Polynesia, many of which are far apart. So how, in ancient times, did people get on these islands, and did people move back and forth? And how did they progress over time? And it's a really fascinating question. Christina Thompson does a lot of really interesting things with it. I just adored this book. Once I finished it, I was really struggling going back and forth about whether or not I should put The Only Plane in the Sky first or Sea People first. We'll see how that all shakes out in the end, but I really liked them. I really liked them both, and this was the first indication that this was going to be a very strong round of reading and a very good cluster of books. Unfortunately, it became clear very quickly that Trick Mirror was going to be the weak link in that. And I say that, and it sounds really harsh. However, I don't think there's a dud in this group. Spoiler alert. So I did end up putting Trick Mirror in last place, 6th place in my ranking. However, I like it. And it feels weird to put a book you like in last place. I think the issue for me, ultimately, was that it felt like there were occasionally like too much in one story. Like I remember at one point in one of the essays, Jodi Tolentino was talking about her experience on reality television. And she does an episode by episode recap, and I don't think that was necessary at all. I think you can get her point in what she's talking about without finding out what happened in every episode. I was never and will never look up the reality show that she was on and watch the episodes. I didn't need that. So even though I thought what she was talking about was interesting, I thought her points and the way she was interrogating her memory of those events and the other memories of the other people who were on that reality show compared to hers, I don't think we needed all of the information she was giving us. And then in another one, she talks about the portrayal of women or representation of women in literature throughout time. And she just keeps giving examples, example after example after example, and it's exhaustive. And a lot of them are illustrating basically the same thing. So it starts almost feeling like there's an element of padding going on. Jodi Tolentino is a journalist. She writes for, I'm blanking on which magazine, The New Yorker. She's a staff writer at The New Yorker. And I feel like a lot of the time I would want the magazine version of these stories, because when your story is appearing in a magazine, you have to edit it. There's limited space. It feels like for the book, there's a lot more information padded in to kind of fill out a page count, and all I want is the magazine version. Like, illustrate your point, tell me what you're saying, and that's it. And it feels like a lot of the information in here is kind of unnecessary. Like, in that essay, we're talking about the representation of women. Maybe pick 4 examples, and you're good. You've got it all covered. I don't need to hear about Twilight, The Hunger Games, Madame Bovary, The Awakening, and countless others. Like, maybe pick just those, so you can talk about how representation has changed over time, or maybe how it's the same, similar over time. But I don't need the volume of examples that is in the book. And sometimes I don't always agree with what Jodi Tolentino is saying. I think she can be a little bit, she talks about campus sexual harassment, and she uses an example from the college that she went to, and I understand why she used that, and I understand why she focuses on that, but it feels like she's missing the big picture of the story by focusing it in so narrowly. So there were little nitpicks like that, which I've talked about at length, so it sounds like I'm really complaining about the book. But that's why it ended up being the weak link in the group for me. Which again feels weird to say, because I did enjoy it, and I would recommend it. I think it's an interesting book. It has some interesting points. It just, compared to the others, didn't hold up as well, or there were enough little problems that it ended up on the bottom for me. And once I was, I think, halfway through, it was pretty clear that that's where it was going to end up for me. Then I went on to the audio of The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee, Native America from 1890 to the Present by David Treuer. This is interesting because it's a kind of a direct answer to the book Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee by D. Brown, because David Treuer read that book or learned it in school, I can't remember which, and always took issue with it, because it seems like what Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee is saying to David Treuer is that Native American history or culture essentially ended with the Battle of Wounded Knee in 1890. And obviously, so much happened after that to Native Americans, about Native Americans, and there is still a Native American culture in this country, obviously. So David Treuer wrote this book to kind of combat that element of Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, and also to illustrate all of the things that happened after. All of the good things, the bad things, mostly bad things, spoiler alert. He does kind of do a bit of an intro into Wounded Knee in the beginning, doesn't cover too much of that ground. It's much more about everything that came after. To me, this is a fascinating book. It is a history book through and through, but I found everything in it fascinating. And I'm sure part of that is that you take your own baggage into a book with you. I, in recent years, have been very, I don't want to say involved, but I have been learning about and dealt with a lot of current Native American programs, reservations, and legal drama, and all of that. I have dealt with the BIA, I have dealt with Native Child Protective Services, I have dealt with tribal courts. There's a passage in the book where they talk about Browning and the Flathead Reservation, and that is one that I am particularly knowledgeable with. And as David Treuer is talking about, say, Browning, everything he was saying really checked out and resonated with me. Like, there's a point where he's going there to meet with somebody, and he asks where they should go, and the person tells him, well, the only place that you can meet in Browning is the casino. And I was just nodding my head like, yes, that is true. That checks out. So everything about this was just fascinating to me. I really enjoyed it, even though it's like The Only Plane in the Sky. It's a difficult book. Not a lot of good things happened to Native American people before 1890 or after 1890. And the legacy of all of those bad things is painful, especially as a white person. So it's difficult from that perspective, but it's just, I really enjoyed this book. And as I was listening to it, it became very clear that it was going to be my number one in the ranking, and that it was going to be very difficult for any book to surpass it. And that is the way it stays. Heartbeat at Wounded Knee was my number one ranking. And spoiler alert, it got eliminated. It hurts. I mean, I'm beginning to think that me ranking something number one is actually a bit of a curse, because the thing I ranked number one, Inland by Taya Obret, in the first round also got eliminated. So maybe I need to think more carefully about that in the future. But anyway, that's getting ahead of myself. That was The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee. And then I listened to She Said, Breaking the Sexual Harassment Story That Helped Ignite a Movement by Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey. I listened to this on the Libby app. I guess I got it from my library, but it was an audiobook. Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey are reporters for the New York Times. They broke the story about Harvey Weinstein and the legacy of abuse he had committed, and which had been covered up for him at the Weinstein Company and in Hollywood in general. And that part of the book, I think, is stellar. If that had been the only part of the book, this could have been a challenger for number one, because the part that is about their investigation and what happened immediately after the story broke is fascinating. And it's really shows, I don't work in journalism, obviously. So finding out details about how journalism works and the way you have to do checks and balances and make sure that you're getting the true story is fascinating. But also the way they came at the story and how difficult it was for them to get the information they needed. Even if people were willing to talk up to them about what happened to them, they were terrified to go on the record unless they could get more people to agree to go on the record. Famous people like Ashley Judd, Gwyneth Paltrow factors in a fair amount. And for these people, there is real fear, there is pain, and there is a lot of back and forth. One of the things Gwyneth Paltrow struggles with is that she had a Harvey Weinstein story, but she also got her career out of Harvey Weinstein movies and how he pushed for her. She got her Oscar off of a Harvey Weinstein movie, which also won Best Picture, Shakespeare in Love, upsetting Saving Private Ryan. So she almost felt like she didn't have a right to tell her story at all, and that people would think she was a hypocrite. All of that is fascinating. What weakened the story for me was that in its second half, and I understand why Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey decided to do this, because they talk about how unexpectedly the Harvey Weinstein story that they published got more people to tell their story. And the whole Me Too movement really got going after that came out. So then they go on and tell the story of Christine Blasey Ford, which is interesting, obviously, and relates to what the first half of the book was about. However, the first half of the book is very much about Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey's reporting. That was their story. They did the investigating. That's it. The section about Christine Blasey Ford is much more recap of other people's work and what happened. And Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey are very removed from it. So I understand that what they're trying to do is Harvey Weinstein, cool. He's in jail now. But how much has really changed? How much is the Me Too movement actually going to manage to change things when look what happened right after? Justice Brett Kavanaugh was confirmed despite a woman coming forward and having a credible allegation against him and being willing to tell her story. And to me, it just doesn't feel like the two parts of the book connect all that well, because like I said, Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey are the driving force of the first book, and they're absent almost entirely from the second half of the book. And to me, that disconnect was enough to weaken the book. It ended up in 5th place, ultimately. So that led to the last book, which I read in the last part of May, just under the wire, and I was stressed out getting it that close. I basically had a week to finish a book, not even, maybe 5 days to finish A Woman of No Importance by Sonia Purnell. So on the one hand, I was really stressed out, like, oh, am I going to be able to fit this in? Is it going to be a struggle? Am I going to like this last book? I don't even know. I felt like my rankings were pretty set in stone at this point. I didn't know what this one was going to do. Well, let me tell you, A Woman of No Importance, the untold story of the American spy who helped win World War II, is compulsively readable. It's very much narrative nonfiction, which I know some people use as a pejorative, some people use as a plus. I can take it or leave it. To me, it really depends on the execution. In this book, it is told really well. This is a nonfiction book that reads like a spy thriller, and a really good spy thriller. It's the story of Virginia Hall, who is an American woman who really struggles growing up with the expectations that are being put on her and what she wants to do with her life. She has an adventurous spirit. She keeps trying to get into diplomacy, and because she is a woman, she's never given a very fair shake. She spends a lot of time in Europe. She ends up losing one of her feet in a hunting accident and has to be amputated. So not only is she a woman trying to get into diplomacy, she is a woman with a disability trying to get into diplomacy, and she just can't catch a break. Finally, she manages to meet somebody who works for the Special Operations Executive, the SOE in Britain, and they hire her to be a plant in France after France was occupied by the Nazis in World War II. And because she is an American, and at that point Americans were not involved in the war, she is able to take cover as a journalist and go into these areas. And because she is a woman, people don't necessarily suspect her. Of course, there are other operatives who are planted in France. She ends up being the only one who really manages to embed herself into the region and to grow a resistance movement and operations. And the longer she does that, and the more people around her struggle and she has to help them, the more danger she finds herself in. And then, of course, she goes on to other adventures throughout the war. I don't want to spend too much time talking about the book. All I will say is this book is thrilling and fascinating, and it talks about gender and expectation and politics, because obviously World War II is raging at the time. It's just a fascinating book, very well told and thoroughly researched, and I loved it. So I ended up putting it in 2nd place in my ranking, which is not what I had expected, and it was not a problem fitting this book in at the end of the round at all. So ultimately, my rankings were: 1st place, Heartbeat of Wounded Knee, obviously. 2nd place, A Woman of No Importance, which I just loved. I had a really hard time deciding 3rd place between The Only Plane in the Sky by Garrett Graff and Sea People. I loved both of those books. Later in June, I am going to be doing my mid-year wrap-up. I think both of them are going to be listed in my favorite books of the year so far. I really enjoyed both of them. Well, enjoyed is tough because that was part of the thing. It's like, to me, Sea People was a really enjoyable read that I found fascinating and really loved. Only Plane in the Sky was extremely difficult, kind of painful, made me cry nonstop, but is important. So I didn't know which one, and then I really enjoyed both books, so I was terrified that one of them wouldn't advance because I put it in 4th place. What would happen? So I ended up putting The Only Plane in the Sky in 3rd place, and then Sea People in 4th place, but that was still super painful for me to do. And then She Said got 5th place, and Trick Mirror by Gia Tolentino ended up last. But again, I liked She Said and Trick Mirror. It's just that there were enough problems with them, or the way they're structured, or the way they were executed, that ultimately they ended up in last place for me. So, of those, I mentioned already that Heartbeat of Wounded Knee got eliminated, which just makes me sad. I really think that's an important book. I hope if you're watching this, you will give it a chance and read it and take in the story, because it was my number 1. So you know I'm a fan. So the books that advanced were Sea People, The Only Plane in the Sky, and A Woman of No Importance. And I'm very happy to see them advance. I am sad to lose The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee. And again, I liked She Said in Trick Mirror, but I'm okay seeing them not advance. And that was the quarterfinals for the BookTube Prize, Nonfiction Group D. I am actually going to be taking a round off in the semifinals. I had initially signed up and was asked if I would like to participate in the fiction group this time around. I decided I'm going to sit this one out because as much as I'm enjoying participating, I have not been able to focus too hard on my Read Outside Your Comfort Zone challenge. There's some books that I've been putting off until later in the year so I can get all of my BookTube Prize titles in. And I want to spend some time doing that, especially since in June I want to really prioritize LGBTQ books because it's Pride Month and there is not actually going to be Pride, at least not where I live. So if I participated in this round, I was really going to be stressing myself out to get 6 books read in July, and I know I could do it, but I have a buddy read of a long book planned in July, and I really want to get to one of my books for my Read Outside Your Comfort Zone challenge is another long book, and I want to try to get to that in July as well. So it was that question, do it and put those off, or try to take some time and get all of that in. And I really want to take some time to get that in. So I am hoping to be back for the finals. Don't know if I'll be on fiction or nonfiction, but that is the hope and the plan. We'll see how it goes. That is not really everything that I talked about in the vlog, but it's probably enough. I think I got most of the points in. It is what it is. No point feeling bad about it now. So if you have followed along up to this point, I thank you and I appreciate it. And I am looking forward to seeing what advances into the finals after this round. And of course, I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.